Hello friends, welcome to Be Waste Wise. I'm Shweta Bandapani. I am the community builder at Be Waste Wise. Today we have Kate Bailey, who is the policy and research director for EcoCycle. I'm Shweta. And she has agreed to moderate a panel for us. This is actually the first of a series of panels that she's going to be moderating for Be Waste Wise. You will remember her from the Global Dialogue on Waste last year, where she was a panelist. And in today's panel, we have Madeline Keating, who's from the Natural Resources Defense Council. She's an urban fellow with NRDC's Healthy People and Thriving Communities program. And she's also the city lead for NRDC's Food Matters project. We have two panelists from the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. We have Elaine Blatt, who's a senior policy and program analyst. And we have Peter Canepa, who provides lifecycle assessment expertise to Oregon's materials management program. So that's a brief introduction. And as they speak, they'll talk to you more about their work. So I'm quickly going to hand this over to Kate. So over to you, Kate. I'm going to mute myself now.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today and whenever you watch this future broadcast. I am so excited to have a jam-packed session full of great speakers. Food rescue and recovery is becoming an increasingly important topic for a number of reasons. And I'm really excited to have a really great broad perspective from both the local and state government angle, as well as from an organizational standpoint. There's so many ways we want to increase food rescue and decrease food waste as part of our environmental and social goals. And so we'll talk about a lot of those opportunities and some of those challenges and debunk some of the myths along the way on the path about food rescue. So we are joined by Maddie Keating with NRDC. Maddie is based in Denver, Colorado, and then Elaine and Peter with Oregon DEQ. So thank you all for getting up a little early our time to join the webinar. So without further ado, let's jump into the topic here. So there's been a lot of great research from a number of entities, including NRDC, over the past several years about the scale of our food waste problem. And so within the scope of what to do with all this food waste, we want to work on the waste reduction hierarchy. So we really want to look at food waste prevention and then food waste recovery, and then sort of put our end-of-life composting options at the end of the list of preferences. So Maddie, I was hoping you could get us started with a little background on where food rescue falls into those efforts and why it is so important in terms of reducing the overall impacts of our food waste.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Kate. Can everyone hear me okay? So as Kate mentioned, I'm based in Denver with the Natural Resources Defense Council. And yeah, food waste is a huge issue, and food rescue and recovery are a great opportunity to think about that. So as a whole, thinking about food waste and how it links to rescue.
Maddie, can you talk up just a little bit?
Oh yeah, can you hear me now?
That's perfect, yeah.
Okay, so imagine you go to the grocery store and purchase 5 bags of food, and when you're heading out of the store, you drop 2 of those 5 bags in the parking lot and don't look back. Meanwhile, right down the street, there's neighbors that don't have the means to purchase that same food and don't know where their next healthy meal is going to be coming from. So this is a widespread issue. Up to 40% of the US food supply goes uneaten each year, while simultaneously more than 41 million people in the US alone lack a secure supply of food on their tables. So when this food is wasted, so are all the resources that go into producing it, including 21% of our fresh water used for agricultural uses, 2.6% of all US greenhouse gas emissions annually, 1,250 calories per person per day, and about $218 billion wasted per year. So if we could redirect just 1/3 of that food that we toss out each day, including all of the resources that are used to provide that food, it would more than cover our unmet food needs across the country. So food recovery efforts that connect surplus food to food insecure individuals play a really key role in emergency food assistance and short-term food insecurity, while also reducing wasted food. And it's important to note that while food donation alone does not rectify the causes of poverty and the broken systems that drive hunger, it's also important to understand that it really plays a vital role in meeting these short-term gaps in food availability. And while each of us should make an effort to prevent food from being wasted in the first place and think about how much food we're sourcing and think about how much food we're eating in our own kitchens, rescuing food is also an important solution as an environmental solution for food waste, a health and hunger solution, and more cities, regions, and organizations are recognizing this and playing a really important role in helping communities to recover surpluses of really healthy and nourishing food. So it's a really important piece of the food waste movement, as well as an important role in reducing hunger.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the environmental impacts of food waste are astonishing, as well as the social need. And so it really is an exciting opportunity to make a tremendous impact. And I think that's why we're seeing a lot of great movement in this space. So I want to jump over to Elaine and Peter. And I'm wondering if either of you or both of you can talk a little bit about what we mean by food rescue and recovery. What kind of programs fall into that category and who's doing some of those efforts?
Sure. First of all, I just want to say that for all of the reasons that Maddie outlined, the state of Oregon is investing a lot of resources in preventing the wasting of food, but also in activities up and down the hierarchy. And Maddie mentioned the hierarchy, and I'll just mention for those folks who aren't entirely familiar with it as it's applied to wasted food. It's a bit like the reduce, reuse, recycle hierarchy that most of us know. And that hierarchy for us in food starts with source reduction, which is fundamental prevention of food waste. But in second place on that hierarchy is feeding human beings, which is where food rescue, we call it rescue, other jurisdictions call it recovery, falls for us. And the reason it comes in second is because it's still sending food to its highest and best use, which is to feed human beings. But that being said, we got interested in questions around the environmental impacts of rescuing food in certain ways. And Peter will talk a bit more about the life cycle assessment that we did to look at that. But we were also interested in some social dynamics around literally the cost to food rescue organizations of collecting food through certain channels, and we're also interested in trying to find out about the relative nutritional value of food that's rescued through different channels. And so we engaged recently in a study, and we interviewed actually food rescue organizations, a variety of them across our state and then a few outside of our state, and based on that study, we determined that there are a few key takeaways. And one key takeaway that's changed up how food rescue works, at least in the United States, is that the need has changed. And what that means is that it used to be the case that food rescue organizations were feeding people who had occasional emergency needs for food. And today that need is different, and it's more regular. We also heard from food rescue organizations that the supply doesn't always match the need. And we also learned, not surprisingly, that these organizations actually know their clients best and know best what their clients need and how they can best meet those needs. So we unfortunately weren't able to do the kind of rigorous analysis around nutrition and the food costs that we wanted to engage in, but we did learn that food rescue organizations actually have preferences about where they want to get food from, and they certainly have preferences for higher nutritional value food. And with that, I will turn it over to Peter to talk, or maybe.
Yeah, let me just, in case that didn't address, Kate, your question. I mean, I think some of the organizations that we're just calling food rescue organizations are anywhere from, institutions like churches, small pantries, even individuals are actors in this system here in Oregon. But the main sort of food rescue organizations we're speaking of are large food banks who have multiple facilities and distributed networks to collect and then redistribute that food. So just to clarify that.
And then I'll just add that the one other thing that we did learn loud and clear from these food rescue organizations is that the problem of hunger in the United States is one of complex food systems, and that food rescue is just a piece of a larger constellation of issues that are involved, that are playing on hunger in our country. And Maddie alluded to the complexity of the problem in her opening remarks.
So really what I'm hearing you all say is that it's a complex problem. It involves the entire food system. This is one positive step toward making change, but then there are a lot of challenges within the system. There are a lot of different players involved. It's sort of a dispersed network on the ground. And so, there's some reasons why we haven't cracked this nut just yet, but I think some exciting potential work ahead. So Maddie, I want to jump over to you and talk a little bit about your work in assessing what is the capacity and potential for food recovery at the local city level and how that could meet some of that unmet food need. And then we'll jump back to Peter and Elaine for more on the environmental impacts and the results of their life cycle study.
Yeah, absolutely. So in 2017, NRDC completed 2 reports with support from the Rockefeller Foundation that focused in on 3 U.S. cities, Nashville, Denver, and New York City. We've, in this work, realized that a lot of solutions to this pretty local problem of food rescue and food security can be best tackled at the city. So we wanted to understand the baseline of what's happening in those cities. So the first report was a baseline food waste report, estimating the quantities and the types of food waste at the city level. The second report modeled the potential to increase food rescue in each of these cities. So on the second report, looking at food rescue, we overwhelmingly found that food rescue can be expanded. In fact, hypothetically, up to 68 million more meals could be donated per year in the 3 cities, Denver, Nashville, and New York City combined. So this report, which was written by Joanne Berkenkamp at NRDC, as well as the rest of the food waste team, explored 2 kind of scenarios for doing this analysis. So the first was a maximum scenario, assuming the uppermost limit of the amount of surplus that could potentially be available for donation. So that is the idea that we can rescue all edible food in the city. The second was a little bit more realistic, an ambitious scenario that used much more realistic assumptions about food rescue and existing donation patterns. For some of the reasons that we've talked about, we don't necessarily want to rescue all the food available because people want healthy food and they want nourishing food. So that's something to take into consideration. So I work primarily in Denver, and in Denver alone, we found that under the maximum scenario, expanded food rescue efforts could potentially help meet an additional 46% of annual food needs, which is overwhelming. Under the more ambitious scenario, it was a little bit closer to 10%. So if we're really increasing our food rescue, we have the potential to rescue between 10 and 46% in Denver alone of rescuable food. So that's pretty impressive. And we've looked in this report at the sectors. We did a sector analysis that was based off of our first report, looking at the baseline food waste in each city. And we found that grocery retail overwhelmingly showed the greatest untapped potential of all the sectors we studied, followed by some of the institutional sectors, including hospitality, higher ed, healthcare, and K-12. So the grocery retail has opportunity really for getting that produce and protein that people are wanting and needing in their daily diets. And then institutional food sectors really brings in those high volumes of prepared food that also are oftentimes healthy and serving a lot of fruit. So I'm happy to go more into those food sectors in a little bit more detail, but I'll send it back over to you, Kate.
I think that's great. Thanks, Maddie. What I'm hearing you say, and I think is important for our audience, is you looked at several different cities in depth, but I think your report found they were fairly representative of things happening across the country. I mean, the amount of the potential to meet the food need is going to vary, but the bottom line is it's significant. You know, nearly 50% in Denver is huge. So I think that's a big lesson learned. And then it's also very interesting in hearing about the sectors, because I think that's really important guidance for cities moving forward. I think a lot of us have this idea of like restaurants are wasting all this food all the time, and we don't necessarily see what's happening in the back of the grocery store or the institutional cafeterias or the school district. And so I think your report gave cities some really good direction on where to get the best bang for their buck when these programs are starting off.
Yeah, and I'll just add on that point. First of all, it was really interesting, and like you said, I tend to hone in on Denver, and we picked those 3 cities because they show a variety of land use types and population density and just basic culture around food. They're distributed around the country, and the numbers were pretty similar. I think the number was a little bit less in New York City, but still high. And so it just goes to show that in each of these cities, there are opportunities to look at the same solutions, but you also need to hone them in for your specific city, thinking about, you know, how you get around, what systems are already in place. And on that restaurant piece, restaurants showed a lot of potential for increased food rescue. Because like I said, the potential for food rescue in the sectors was based on our baseline food waste report, looking at the quantities and types of food waste. And so restaurants showed a lot because there's a lot of food waste coming out of them, but much of that is post-consumer material and it's not appropriate for donation. So while it would fill a lot of the gap if restaurant donations could be taken to scale at the maximum potential, it's not necessarily the biggest bang for your buck because you're getting such small quantities that are not necessarily the highest quality.
I think that's a great point. And so
Kate, we can't hear you.
How about I unmute myself instead of mute myself? There we go. Peter, I wanted to jump over to you, and I think Maddie's work really helps illustrate some best practices for communities, and I think you are on the same path. I think Oregon DEQ is trying to set some guidelines and sort of best practices and establish what works and again, what's the best bang for our buck for food rescue, but in a different way. So can you guide us through your life cycle analysis findings?
Yeah, sure. I thought that's a great segue. The sort of bang for your buck is kind of right at the heart of what we tried to answer with our life cycle assessment. Instead of looking at dollars, what we were looking at was environmental impacts. And so what we tried to study here was, at least here in Oregon, we know that food waste or the wasting of food occurs at all different steps along the food supply chain. And so It could be at a farm where, the produce is just not harvested to its fullest capacity for various systemic reasons. Or it could be at a retail store, or it of course could be at an individual's home. So we know that this food waste or wasting of food occurs at these different steps. And what we wanted to understand was, when you rescue food from these different points along the supply chain, how do you do it? And what does that mean in terms of environmental impacts of rescuing that food? For example, is it always better to rescue food from a farm, or is it always better to get it after it's been prepared and all that environmental impact upstream has been invested in it? And so we used a tool called Lifecycle Assessment. I might just call it LCA for simplicity's sake from here on out. But LCA is just basically a way of accounting for everything that is required from an environmental standpoint to do something, and everything that is emitted back to the earth to do that something. And it could be anything. It could be food rescue, or it could be making, coffee or widgets or iPhones or anything. So LCA is just a tool, a systematic way to look at a system or a material. And so, yeah, that's kind of what we set out to test. And if you want, Kate, I can jump into some of the key findings, or, yeah. Okay. Right. So here in Oregon, we looked at our primary objective, as I mentioned, was to evaluate different ways of rescuing food at different points in the supply chain. And I guess I should clarify, I mean, the sort of impetus for this was, and I think Maddie even said this, that there are there are environmental benefits associated with food rescue. And that can be true, but we sort of wanted to test, well, is that always true? So that was our main objective here. And we looked at around 8 different types of food rescue. So redistributing food from farms. So like, the Oregon Food Bank goes out to a farm, pays a crew to go harvest all that produce, and then brings it back here to Oregon and redistributes it. We looked at different forms of gleaning, so sort of individuals or volunteers collaborating to go out and gather food that's just been left either on the field or even in urban agricultural settings. We looked at retail and grocery donations, so donation from retail establishments. And then we also looked at prepared food donations, so donation of prepared food from retail stores, from commercial kitchens, and even through sort of something we have in the States here, which I'm calling a food rescue app. So these are kind of like a social network where individuals like myself could download this app and find available prepared food throughout the city to go rescue on my own and then redistribute. So we looked at these different types of rescue, and kind of the key findings, without being able to show you all the charts and graphs, were that surprisingly, one of the biggest and maybe counterintuitive things that we found was that in talking to these organizations that do this rescue is that even this rescued food can end up being wasted by the recipient or even by the rescue organization. And I think that's a little surprising, right? We feel like, well, this food is going to hungry people. How could it be wasted? But we don't know the exact amount that gets wasted. But what we found in this study was that from an environmental impact standpoint, the amount that gets wasted after being rescued is a critical determinant in the overall environmental impacts. We also found that the type of transportation that was required to go out and rescue food mattered, and it mattered also how far you had to travel, right? So how efficient your transport was, but also how far out you had to go to bring that food back to be distributed to hungry individuals. One thing I think that's touted as one of the key drivers for the environmental benefits of rescuing food is that we're diverting that food from that organic material from going into a landfill. And there's no disputing that keeping organic material out of a landfill has some environmental benefits. But what we found was that the benefits of landfill diversion are really dependent on how much you had to invest up front in all those rescue activities, right? So they're relative to what it took to rescue that food to begin with. So if that's not clear, we can unpack that more. But there are benefits of diversion. However, it depends on what you had to put in to divert the food to begin with. We also found that our study scope didn't include all those upstream sunk costs, which Maddie mentioned, and which are absolutely vastly important to the environmental impact of the food system. So, growing the food to begin with, all the fertilizer and agricultural practices and processing and all that stuff that happens upstream. We cut that out of our study. I don't really have time to probably explain the nuance of why we think that's justified. But just to test the sensitivity and relevance of that, we did kind of tack that on for a bit of a sensitivity analysis. And what we saw is when you include all the upstream investment in environmental inputs and outputs to grow food and to process it and to distribute it, that impact upstream dominates the life cycle, makes rescue look like a very de minimis or small contributor overall. And so I think that, that supports what we've heard and what we've stated, that moving up the hierarchy and trying to prevent food from being wasted in the first place is a good thing. But yeah, so I think those were some of our key findings. Let me stop there. That was a lot.
Well, thank you, Peter. I can appreciate, and I think the audience probably can too. Life cycle analysis is very complicated, and there's a lot of science and a lot of graphs behind it. So Peter, you did a great job of explaining that without a lot of things on the screen. So I want to encourage everyone to go check out the report on the Oregon DEQ website. There are some really great in-depth findings, a lot of fantastic analysis. And I think, so before we launch into a little bit more conversation about that, I want to remind our audience that we are going to be taking questions from you for our panelists. So if you have questions, please go ahead and type them into the chat box. One of the things we're particularly interested in hearing from the audience is how food rescue and recovery might look different in your area of the world. We are very focused on this call on US programs, but we're not sure how your programs might be a little different. And we think these findings are very relevant, but we're finding even within the US, there are a lot of geographic and demographic differences. So feel free to chime in with some thoughts on how this applies to your neck of the woods. So, so with that, I want to come back to you, Peter. And I think what I'm hearing you say is that food rescue is very important, but there's also, we have a lot of personal passion around it. Like we see this wasted food and we want to capture it, and that's very well intentioned, but maybe not always. It's just not, we can't accept it as sort of a blanket environmental good, that there's a lot of different criteria around how we go about capturing it. And then we really have to have a conversation with those who need it to make sure that it is actually going to be used once we go through all the effort of getting it to that location.
Yeah, I think you did a great job of succinctly summarizing kind of where our findings led, right? Like, if you're going to go out and rescue food, be sure that it's, going to meet the key needs and going to be eaten so that it's nutritious and very likely to be eaten. And as you said, Kate, there can be instances where you invest all this extra effort only for that food to end up being wasted because it's either not known to the recipient, like how to treat it or handle it. It's not nutritious, or for any other of various reasons that food might be wasted by anyone. These same reasons apply to food that's rescued. So if all that effort goes into rescuing it only for it to be wasted, then there isn't necessarily an environmental benefit.
Great. So Maddie, let's jump back to you. I want to follow up on some of the work that NRDC is doing as sort of the next step in the project, and looking at, given the potential to rescue food under the right circumstances, as we're hearing from Peter and Elaine. Tell me a little bit more about how you guys are helping cities figure out and make recommendations on how to improve that food recovery infrastructure and network.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I briefly mentioned the Food Matters Project, and the research that we did in 2007 was kind of the first phase of that project. So
Maddie, can you get closer you are to the camera, the better we can hear you. So perfect.
Okay, how about now?
Better. Awesome.
Okay, so our current Food Matters work builds on the findings from NRDC's baseline reports. We're working now directly in cities to think about how to implement innovative solutions and strategies to reduce food waste and increase food rescue. So we are working with we're working directly with city agencies and local partners in a number of what are called light touch cities, and in 2 deep engagement cities. And those 2 cities are Denver and Baltimore. And we're working to implement innovative and system-wide food waste reduction strategies. So we are really touching on a lot of the things that Elaine and Peter spoke to. One of the first things that we did as part of this was to do a landscape assessment around food rescue to understand the unique and specific conditions of Denver's food rescue scene. And we are doing a similar report in Baltimore. And we came out with a lot of recommendations and really important findings from that again, really echo what we've already heard today. So broadly, our analysis in Denver identified the need for collaboration and building a unified voice and culture of collaboration among rescuers and last mile organizations. So last mile organizations are the organizations that distribute food directly to those in need, such as pantries and homeless shelters. We also found the need to improve the quality and usability of donated foods, as we've talked about, increasing the number of last mile organizations to just make more connections to people in need, and innovation in end user delivery. End user meaning the people that utilize the food rescue system or the clients. And a really important thing of what we found that Peter spoke to, Elaine spoke to, and Kate spoke to is that these organizations know their clients best. The conversations about how to build out the food rescue system need to have substantial input from the people that use the food rescue system, because they know how challenging it is to get around the city to get to these food rescue organizations. They know what kind of food they want to be eating, or know what some of the barriers are to them not being able to bring home certain types of food. So it's really, really important to engage end users and try to understand the qualitative measures of the experience of getting food rescue so that we are doing it in the right way. And then we also heard about increasing quality standards. If a lot of organizations will donate food and donate it for the sake of donating it, but what food rescuers want to see is standards in what they're donating, because they don't want to just take food for the sake of it being donated. They want good quality food. And just in general, there's in places like Denver, for example, there's so many moving parts. There's so many local partners, and how do we bring those people together so that they're working in coordination and not against each other in this really diverse ecosystem? And that's just a huge part of this is collaboration and building out coalitions. Specifically with the city, we're trying to think about what role the city plays in thinking about collaboration and engagement. One of the things we've done specifically is work with our health inspectors in Denver. So health inspectors play really unique opportunities as being ambassadors for food waste reduction because they're frequently talking to the people that are going to be donating food. So in Denver, we started by doing a training with health inspectors on food waste and the importance of raising awareness amongst food facilities in food donation. And recently, the Health Inspector's Office, in collaboration with NRDC, created a brochure that they're handing out to all of their food facilities with information on the Good Food Samaritan Food Donation Act, on tax credits, on how to handle food that is going to be donated, and what organizations to call if they want to donate. So this is a really unique opportunity for just education and awareness around the possibility to donate from organizations. The other thing we're finding is doing stakeholder engagement and community ownership. And then another place that we've worked, which is really, really exciting, is doing local partners capacity grants. So like I said, there's a pretty impressive ecosystem in Denver around food rescue. And a lot of these organizations are doing just classic food rescue. A lot of them are doing it as a programmatic feature of building more sustainable community food systems. And so what we did is we gave $10,000 grants to local organizations around Denver working in food rescue, sustainable community food systems, food scrap recycling, and wasted food prevention. And these local capacity grants were like they sound, to build capacity. They're not to create a new innovative program, but they're to help these organizations do the work that they're good at doing and make the connections that they need to make so that the food rescue system can be built out. So a lot of this infrastructure is there in some capacity, and it just needs the mechanisms to build out, which is a really important thing to consider.
Absolutely. And I think the right approach to take as well. You know, there's a lot of groups that have been working on feeding hungry people for a long time, and they know what they're doing. And I think our role is to help them succeed and grow and potentially put a different lens on it from an environmental perspective, not just a social perspective. So yeah, really scaling up and working with the folks who know what they're doing on the ground and building those partnerships, I think is a great fit. And I'm curious, Elaine and Peter, so we've heard from Maddie on the local city level and some of their strategies. I'm wondering from the state level, you know, you guys are a little bit of a different jurisdiction, if you can speak to some of the same approaches that you may be taking, as Maddie had mentioned, or some different things along the lines of the LCA study.
Yeah, I have to say that everything that Maddie talked about with regard to the things that they learned in their NRDC work just really resonated with us here in the state of Oregon. The notion of collaboration, of working directly with food rescue organizations who actually know what's going on and what they're doing and what they need, it all plays a role in how we're operating. Interestingly, similar to NRDC, Oregon DEQ operates a grants program for waste prevention grants writ large, and it's been the case that a number of those grants year on year have gone to food rescue organizations to help them improve their capabilities to collect and redistribute food. So that's one of the major things that we're doing throughout the state. As a state agency, we don't engage in a lot of direct activity. We support the activities of others, and so we do that through grants. We also do that through providing information to local governments who are really doing the work on the ground, and then doing studies like this, like the LCA, so that our local governments and our local food rescue organizations have information that they can use to promote and improve their services.
Great. So it sounds like there's a lot of similarities that can happen both at the local level and the state level. So that's good to hear. I think we need more players on the ground. So I'm wondering a little bit, if I want to throw this kind of open question to everybody here. We've talked a lot about the importance of food recovery. We've talked about how to scale up solutions. And then we've also recognized that maybe all food shouldn't be rescued, either because it doesn't have nutritional value or there's a high environmental impact to driving around and picking it up. It's maybe not a 100% acceptable solution all of the time. And so that leads me to think from a recycling and composting perspective, how are we managing that food that is not recovered and is instead wasted? And so Maddie mentioned a little bit about promoting food scrap composting. And so I'm just wondering if anybody wants to speak to how to help these groups properly manage the food that they're not able to rescue.
I can just say a little. I'm certainly not a organics recovery expert, but I can just tell you in our study, we looked at what's happening to this material in Oregon on average. So one of our key variables in the model was if the food is rescued and then wasted, what happens to it? And what we found is that some entities like the Oregon Food Bank explicitly had a mechanism by which any food that they rescued that they had to cull or that wasn't fit to then pass on to donate for individuals, they explicitly put that in a composting system. So they had, they sort of looked at what is if the food is going to be wasted, what's the highest and best use of that material, and found that composting was one of the best ways to treat food scraps from an environmental standpoint. As a side note, we did, as a separate piece of work, a study that explicitly asked that question. If you have organic materials like food, what are the best ways to handle it at end of life from an environmental standpoint? And so we looked at composting, anaerobic digestion, traditional landfilling, and then we called it in sink sort of garbage disposal. I don't know what the right word is, but putting it down your sink and into the wastewater system. And so that's another kind of interesting piece of research that that's available, and I would suggest we can share with the group afterwards. But yeah, in Oregon, what happens to this food on average is still that about 80% of it ends up being landfilled, which is the least is the worst environmental choice for handling food at end of life. And only about on the order of about 15% is either composted or digested anaerobically, and the remaining 5% ends up being incinerated. We have one incinerator here in the state of Oregon. So that was built into our model, and what we see is that we could do better with handling that food at end of life if it is going to be wasted. But that's a discussion we would rather focus on. Let's not waste it to begin with, instead of let's focus all this effort on decreasing landfilling. So.
Yeah, I'll add to that as well. And I think that's a really good point. It's really important to consider is we don't use all the food that is rescued. And it's not fixed. We've got a long way to go to get that rescued. As Peter said, about 80% still goes to of the food that's rescued that is wasted. And there's a lot of components to this. So in a traditional food pantry, say a church, you've got maybe one or two individuals volunteering for a few hours a week, maybe for one food pantry in the basement of a church. And they are trying to get food to their communities, and composting or the food waste side of this might not be on their radar. And there's probably not the funding mechanisms or infrastructure to build in a compost. And so what needs to happen at that level is education and awareness around this issue and how it's all linked together throughout the food rescue ecosystem, so that when, say, the church basement is thinking about ramping up their food rescue operations, is there a possibility for them to also think about getting a compost bin? And I think what this comes down to is in my mind, the biggest solution to this issue is that we cannot address this problem of food waste before it gets rescued, after it gets rescued, with whatever, however it works. We cannot work in silos. So we've mentioned the food waste or the food recovery hierarchy of prevention, rescue, and food scrap recycling. And the fact of the matter is that all of these are part of a system, and we need to connect the different partners and the different players to have, say, the folks in the church basement connect to the local composting company that's driving around and bringing their compost to, say, a community garden. And if those players don't know each other, then it's never going to happen. Another important piece of this is that the system is in place right now that you're doing a really good thing if you donate food to a food rescuer. And once you do that, it's done, it's out of your hands, you've donated it, you get your tax credit. But we need to think about holding those donators accountable for what they're donating, because it's not gone, it's not away, it's just going to the next place. And just as they need to be thinking about, well, do I add composting next to my trash? When they're donating food, they need to think about the quality of that food, whether the lifetime of that food. Is it already going to the end of its life so that it has to be redistributed within like a couple hours? And how do we get donators to think about those quality standards? And then another piece of this, I think, is education and end users. And so we've talked a little bit about making sure that food is going to be eaten. And that comes down to some components of cultural appropriateness and learning how to use different foods. So one of our local partners in Denver is a urban farm, and they have a no-cost grocery program every week. And as part of that no-cost grocery program, they also do a community cooking class. And this organization is located in a primarily Latino community. And so the types of food are much different than the standard American diet. And so when they get a bunch of food that the Latino community might not be used to getting or might not want, they have a cooking class so that you can sub in certain foods for more traditional meals. And that's a really, really important piece of this, because if you don't know how to cook it and you don't know how to use it, you're not going to take it and it's going to be wasted. So education and cultural appropriateness are also really key parts of that conversation.
That's great, Maddie. Those were a lot of great points that you hit on, both in terms of cultural appropriateness and education. And I love the point about holding donators accountable. Maybe they should be funding some of this composting infrastructure at food banks. But the most important thing I think you said was that this really has to be a systems approach, right? There's a lot of complexities about the entire way we make and consume food, and food rescue is just one part of that. And so, Elaine, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to, you alluded a little bit to this at the beginning, but in our last few minutes here, I want to give Oregon DEQ some good credit for looking at also food waste and food composting and food recovery. You can kind of outline a little bit for us how you guys are developing a whole sort of food strategy at the state level.
Sure. We actually have a strategy, and it's also available on our website, like almost everything else we do. And we spent a little while thinking about that. That strategy is actually explicitly directed at the prevention, the source reduction piece of this puzzle. And we have a wide variety of activities that we're currently engaged in. Some fundamental foundational research around how much food is wasted in Oregon and why. We're developing materials that we can distribute to local governments and other organizations to help work with people around preventing the wasting of food. And actually, Peter's LCA study fits into that, even though it's not strictly speaking about the source reduction piece. But we're really interested in understanding, as Maddie alluded, that we really do have to think about this problem across the entirety of the life cycle of food, and all of the steps in the hierarchy. And so we're really interested in understanding the impact of the availability of these various steps on how people think about wasting food. And we have and one of our primary concerns, and a concern that we've heard from food rescue organizations, and it's causing us to literally rethink how we're messaging what we're doing around food. The concern we've heard from food rescue organizations is that as important as food rescue is, and as important as feeding people is, the fact that it's sitting in our wasted food hierarchy may start to deliver a message to people that feeding hungry people is a food waste management step. And what we don't want is for people to just assume that if they have excess food, they can feed hungry people, and that's a way for them to discard it. We want feeding hungry people to be a thing of value and not just another step in how people manage their waste. So as I said, we haven't figured out exactly how we're going to manage this question, but we're literally rethinking how we want to talk about food rescue in the overall context of the hierarchy.
That's great. I think that's huge. And even some of our lingo around wasted food, that's not compatible with feeding hungry people healthy food. So there's I think a lot to be gained here. So and we're going to start to wrap us up here. I am thrilled. I've had such a great conversation with such great thought leaders around the country, really looking at a complex problem and putting together the pieces and the partnerships and the research to make a huge difference, both environmentally and socially moving forward. So I wanted to give Peter and Elaine a minute to wrap up with any closing thoughts on their end, and please promote your Oregon DEQ website. And then Maddie, we'll turn it back to you for the same thing, and then we will sign off. So Peter and Elaine, you want to close us out on your end?
Sure. I don't have anything terribly profound to add. I would suggest checking out our research. Just Google Oregon DEQ and strategy for preventing the wasting of food, and that will get you to a lot of the stuff we've spoken about today. I think at the heart of what we are trying to achieve as a state sort of environmental agency is to make sure that our decisions around materials and how to manage them and how we consume them and how much we consume it is placed in a broader context of what that means in terms of its environmental impact. And particularly for food, I think our goal is to, as Elaine kind of was alluding to, is to sort of change the conversation around food and why it's wasted and the role rescue plays in that kind of complex system. So yeah, I'm really interested in trying to get up towards some of those systemic causes of poverty in the world or in our country. Why are people needing to rely on this secondary food system to begin with? And can we address some of those kind of root causes? And I think the food bank here in Oregon put it best. They would like to work themselves out of a job, right? Their goal is not to grow their food rescue operation. It's to raise all boats and bring people to the point where they don't need to rely on that system to begin with. So I think I'll just leave it at that. Elaine, anything to add?
Thank you both for contributing very much to the important conversation and shifting it as it grows. I think that's a very important role that you're playing. So thank you so much. And we will, of course, be promoting your work on the website and social media as we move forward. So Maddie, any closing thoughts for you and link to where people can find more information?
Yeah, just briefly, Elaine and Peter said it perfectly. Like, food rescue is not a waste management strategy, and we really need to rethink the way that we value food and the way that we think about hunger. And they need to be fixed together, but it should not be thought, food rescue should not be thought of as a waste management strategy. I will say that in terms of reducing the amount of food that you personally are wasting, there are ways for you to think about your own food waste in your own home. One of the other findings from the reports that I mentioned is that about 78% of Americans think that they waste less than the average American. And so I encourage you to think about your own behaviors as well as thinking about this greater system. And you can check out the NRDC website. I can send the link to some of our reports to learn more. And I also encourage you, just in terms of behavior change, to check out savethefood.com, which has some great resources for reducing food waste in your own kitchen.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Maddie, for all the great work you and NRDC are doing on raising this really important topic across the country. So again, pleasure to have such great experts on the phone with us online this morning. So with that, I'm going to close out and hand it back to Swetha.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Maddie. Thank you, Peter. And thank you, Elaine. It was, as Kate mentioned, it was really great to listen to your thoughts and to have such expertise on a panel at Be Waste Wise. And to those who are listening to the panel, we will put out all the links that the panelists talked about on our social media as well as on our website. So you can head to our Twitter handle, which is @BeWasteWise, and you'll find all the links over there. And we have more panels coming up. Please head to our website, go to the events link, events menu item, and you'll find the next panel. Please register for that panel as well. And we will have more panels that Kate is going to moderate for us this year. So please sign up to our newsletter and you will get updates about that. Thanks to all the panelists. So we can close this session now. Bye-bye.